Welcome back to SM Sports Radio. Got a special episode for you guys today. I'm joined by my good friend JC Mitchell. We're going to be breaking down everything that's happened in college basketball since our last episode. Kind of the flow of this episode is going to be, we're going to talk about the game from Monday night, kind of the implications of it, what we saw, what our takeaways are from it. Then we're going to talk about how this UConn team and the UConn team from last season kind of compared to some other teams that won multiple championships in a small amount of time. So, JC, really glad to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get right into it. So Monday night, UConn defeats Purdue 75-60 to capture back-to-back NCAA tournament championships. First program to do so since Florida in 06-07. JC, I thought it was a pretty masterful game plan by Dan Hurley. He just was able to live with Donovan Clingan guarding Edey one-on-one. And while Edey was able to get his, he kind of shut down the other guards for Purdue and Smith, Lawyer, Gillis, and Jones. Braden Smith had a pretty good game, 12 points. Everybody else, though, combining for just 5. What are your thoughts kind of on that defensive game plan?
I think it was a perfect game plan, and UConn, like they've done all year, really just executed it to a T as well. With the Braden Smith, he had really good first half, I'd say, but the second half you could kind of tell with like Stephen Castle guarding him, the whole court eventually started picking up on him and his shots weren't falling. And then Fletcher Lawyer, I was sitting there watching the game last night and I was like, is he even out there? I feel like I didn't hear him at all. No rebounds, assists hardly, shots not really. And Lance Jones too, there was a time last night, I remember he took a 3 and Cam Spencer just straight up blocked it. So it was really a rough night for them guards to get going besides Edey.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that we saw some other teams kind of try to do the same thing on Purdue throughout this season. But UConn was really the only team that had guys athletic enough to stay on these Purdue guards. And they could really live at all with Edey in the one-on-one there. Talked about Edey getting his. He did have 37 points and 10 rebounds on 15 of 25 shooting. But I thought he really got worn out by Donovan Clingan. We kind of saw the repercussions of that in the second half when Edey went to the line after a media timeout and airballed the front end of a 1-and-1. You don't see that too often, especially from a guy like Edey who's pretty used to playing just about 40 minutes of every game. But I think you had a little bit of a takeaway as to why he was worn out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think the main focal point of what also UConn were trying to do on the offensive end was getting him more involved because, in the tournament, there were more teams. Their center didn't really move much. And when they played UConn, they have a bunch of screens, off-ball screens, on-ball screens, and Edey's not used to that. And Clingan and Samson Johnson, I would say, are more athletic than him. So when they're screening and diving, if he's trying to get back, he's not really going to be able to guard that and off-ball screens as well. So just them being active all night, just making him move a lot more than he's used to doing. He can't move around with them all night for 40 minutes. I don't think Purdue was ready for that.
Yeah, for sure. And I thought Dan Hurley's game plan on the offensive end was pretty good as well. They knew that Purdue was kind of going to play drop coverage there with Edey on Clingan. Edey was kind of able to linger there in the paint. And so that really opened up the mid-range for guys like Tristan Newton and Stephon Castle, who made some really tough buckets. I even think of a time where Tristan Newton challenged Edey over there on the left side, able to get a pretty tough layup type shot to go, and then gave Edey the too small. I missed that initially, but on the replay I caught it. I just thought Purdue did a really good job getting over the screens. That was obviously their game plan, but then UConn on the other side doing an even better job converting on those really tough twos, which they pretty much had to do all night. Only shot 6 of 22 from 3. But I thought they really lived around the basket and in the mid-range. And that's just a credit to Dan Hurley's offense. Those guys knew exactly what to do. That offense is a well-oiled machine. And there was even a point in the second half where UConn just kept getting lob after lob to Samson Johnson, and Purdue really had no answer.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. You have a point, I'd say, on the backcourt in this game, too, if you want to get into that.
Yeah, so UConn outscoring Purdue 55-17 in backcourt points. We've talked about on this podcast before how the tournament is a guard-heavy thing in March Madness. Usually the team with the best guards ends up winning. UConn, I'd say over the tournament, pretty much proved they had the best guards. And when you add that to the most elite rim protector in Donovan Clingan, that's a pretty lethal combination. Tristan Newton obviously winning most outstanding player, 20 points, 5 rebounds, 7 assists. I thought he was just spectacular on Monday night, converting a lot of those mid-range shots around the rim, made a couple timely threes for UConn, and kind of was the catalyst of that run in the second half that just put Purdue out of their misery. I think a lot of people expected if UConn was to win this game, I think a lot of people expected Clingan to be the difference. But I don't know about you, but I think it was really Tristan Newton on Monday night.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Tristan Newton is probably the most underrated player on this UConn team just because he was on the team last year and point guard and won the national championship and did the same thing this year. And, Clingan gets the hype and he deserves it, and so does Stephon Castle. But I think Newton's just as good, maybe even better than them.
Yeah, and Newton, a guy that is not a UConn bred player. He's a transfer that came in, another guy for UConn transferring in, Cam Spencer. Let's just talk about Cam Spencer for a little bit. I know we didn't really
Mhm.
have any notes jotted down about him, but this is a guy that was a career journeyman, spent last year at Rutgers, transferring in this season to UConn. I thought he made a huge difference throughout the season, embodied perfectly what the UConn culture and program is all about. Definitely beloved by his head coach and Dan Hurley. Their personalities seem to mesh pretty much perfectly throughout this season. A guy that oddly enough doesn't have any social media, so doesn't have that distraction at all. I saw some locker room videos after they won, and he was still dribbling a basketball, talking about how we got practice tomorrow. Just an
Yeah.
absolute psycho. I think he was a great piece for UConn to bring in this season. Shot the ball extremely well, around 43% from three this season. Talk a little bit about his impact this season.
Yeah, when I watch Cam Spencer, I always think of him as Dan Hurley on the court. There's basically the same person in my eyes, and he's their energy guy, and I think every team in college basketball needs one, and he's just the best energy guy. And along with that, he's a shooter, defender, rebounder. I mean, last night they were even talking about he's great at selling fouls. I mean, he does everything on the court that you would want out of somebody, really. So, yeah, I think he's also underrated as too. I mean, you could talk about this whole UConn team as players, just you can go on and on, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely a roster top to bottom loaded with talent. I think another element of Cam Spencer that's great is just the entertainment factor. He was chirping with fans throughout the tournament, telling them to go home when the game was pretty much decided. I know last night or Monday night there were a lot of Purdue fans in Arizona there. I heard that it was about 30 to 1. For every 30 Purdue fans, there was about one UConn fan. I saw that even some Arizona State students were paid and given UConn merch to go rep UConn student section because of that long journey. So definitely crazy that UConn was able to overcome the crowd in that aspect, and I thought it was just perfect that Cam Spencer was talking trash throughout last night. Before we move on from the game itself, let's talk about what UConn made Braden Smith do defensively. I think you had a little bit of a point about that.
Yeah, something I noticed also watching the game was Purdue really liked to go that pick and roll with Brandon Smith and Edie. And usually when that was happening, the defenses would collapse on Edie in other games. But it seemed like on Monday night, the UConn shooters just kind of stayed put, and we're asking Braden Smith, go make some plays, take this team to win it tonight, and he wasn't able to do that for him. I mean, he had an all right game, but the second half, Stephen Castle was guarding him. Edie got his, but they really needed Braden Smith to kind of take over in that pick and roll, and he just wasn't able to exploit that.
Yeah, I thought UConn really executed well, just making Braden Smith frustrated, not allowing him to beat them single handedly from that guard position. Obviously, Edie did a lot inside, but really none of the guards, especially outside of Braden Smith, but even Braden Smith, I felt like was flustered. We saw him hit that big 3-pointer stepping back at the end of the first half to kind of give Purdue a little burst of momentum heading into half. But beyond that, he was pretty much shut down, at least scoring the basketball. He made a couple tough mid ranges, wasn't really effective driving the ball to the rim at all. And yeah, that's just another testament to how good this UConn team is defensively. Just a well-oiled machine on both sides of the court, and definitely going to go down in history as one of the greatest teams in college basketball history. And on that note, we're going to kind of segue into comparing this UConn team to some other teams that have won a couple championships in a short span. So before we get into that, let's kind of break down UConn's last two tournament runs. So in 2023 and 2024, UConn obviously won 12 games to win two national titles. What stands out to me immediately is that all of these wins were by at least 13 points. So UConn not really ever stressing in the middle of a game whether they're going to win it or not. They're never having to claw back from behind. The only game that they were trailing at the half was against Iona in the first round in 2023. They were down by 2 points. Then they made a three-pointer on the first possession of the second half and kind of took momentum from there, ended up winning that game by 20 plus. In 2023, they went through Iona, St. Mary's, Arkansas, Gonzaga, Miami, and San Diego State en route to their first national title in the past 2 years, and had a plus 120 point differential there. And I felt like, honestly, comparing this season and last season, Miami is the team that really gave UConn the most problems. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Miami last year with I could say them or Alabama, but both of them kind of were the same in this aspect that their guards really did it all and kind of gave them a little bit of a scare, but UConn eventually would find a way to put them to bed and end their dream.
Yeah, definitely UConn's weakness, if you can call it a weakness with these past two teams, is when opposing teams have elite guard play that can really score the basketball. That's what we saw with Miami and Alabama. That's why they were able to keep it close for as long as they did. Moving on to UConn's 2024 run, obviously it's all still fresh in our minds. You got a blowout of Stetson, a blowout of Northwestern, blowouts of San Diego State and Illinois. Obviously, the Alabama game was pretty close, still ended up winning that game pretty easily. And then a 15-point drubbing of Purdue in the title game for a plus 140 point differential overall. And I think if I had to categorize this UConn team and the UConn team of last year kind of together, what I would say about this team and this program compared to the next two programs that we're going to kind of compare is that these two runs by UConn solidified them as the most dominant team of this 21st century in the past two seasons. I think the point differential kind of speaks for itself in that way. We're going to talk about in a few minutes how Florida and Villanova were unique in their own ways. So with that, I'm going to kind of pass it to you to break down Florida in 2006 and 2007.
So yeah, Florida's back-to-back run was different in the way that they had the same starting five for both seasons, opposed to UConn having almost a completely new starting five. So their run in 2006, they played South Alabama in the first round, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the second round, and then Sweet 16 they faced Georgetown, led by Jeff Green and Roy Hibbert. And then once they took them down, they would go on to face Villanova with Kyle Lowry. Then they wound up playing George Mason in the Final Four, which was the 11th seed that year. And then in the national championship, they took down UCLA, who was loaded with Darren Collison, Aaron Afalo, Jordan Farmar, Luke Mbamute, and Ryan Hollins. And in that run, they had a plus 96 point differential over everybody. And so then in 2007, they would come back and bring the whole starting five back and run it back. And that year, they faced Jackson State in the first round, Purdue in the second round, Butler, who in the Sweet 16, who had Brad Stevens, future Boston Celtics coach, as an assistant on that staff, Oregon in the Elite Eight, and then UCLA in the Final Four, which now this year they had Russell Westbrook, who would go on to be an MVP, average a triple-double, a great NBA player, Aaron Afalo again, Darren Collinson again, and Luke Mbamute. So UCLA kind of different age of college basketball, obviously brought back most of their starting five and added a top probably five player in the country in Russell Westbrook that year. But once they got by them, they would go on to play Ohio State, which was Mike Conley and Greg Oden, which I would compare Oden versus Joakim Noah as what we saw on Monday, which was Edie versus Klingon, just a battle of two bigs, and ultimately Florida pulled out the W in that national championship game as well.
Yeah, so immediately after just reading that and hearing you name off all those future NBA guys, future NBA coaches, what I kind of want to categorize this Florida team as is the team that went through the toughest paths en route to their back-to-back. You named players like Russell Westbrook, Kyle Lowry, obviously Mike Conley, Greg Ogden. Like, these are all guys, other than Ogden, who was an NBA bust due to injuries, obviously. These are all guys that went on to have really successful careers in the NBA. And just reflecting back on UConn's path, I can't really think of too many guys that I can see having that same impact at the next level, unless I'm just completely blanking on some guys. I don't think anyone's going to have nearly I don't think anyone's going to have near the impact at the next level as guys like Russell Westbrook and Kyle Lowry has.
Yeah.
So I definitely think this sets apart Florida's back-to-back run as the toughest path from the three that we're going to compare. But let's just jump right in to the third program. It's going to be Villanova in 2016 and 2018. In my opinion, Villanova probably had the best coach of these three programs in Jay Wright, one of the best coaches in college basketball history, in my opinion. In 2016, Villanova's path was UNC Asheville in the first round, then Iowa in the second round, Miami in the Sweet 16, Kansas in the Elite Eight, Oklahoma in the Final Four, which, by the way, they absolutely demolished Oklahoma in this Final Four game, and then UNC in the title game, obviously, the Chris Jenkins buzzer beater. That shot will not be forgotten for a long time. Point differential there of plus 124. And then in 2018, bringing back a lot of the same guys: Radford, Alabama, West Virginia, Texas Tech, Kansas, and Michigan for a point differential of plus 106. So not necessarily as dominant as UConn, not necessarily as tough of a path as I would say Florida in 06-07 took, but I think this was definitely the most loaded roster top to bottom in both of these years, 2016 and 2018. Just to name a few, these are some players that were on these teams: Jalen Brunson, Dante DiVincenzo, Josh Hart, Eric Paschal, and Mikal Bridges. Like, these are all guys that have been impactful at the next level already in their young careers. Jalen Brunson, in my opinion, is one of the best guards in the NBA, certainly underrated, carries that Knicks squad night in and night out. Dante DiVincenzo is a solid piece. He's had stints with the Bucks, the Warriors, and now the Knicks. Josh Hart obviously has had a pretty successful NBA career for as small of a guy as he is. Eric Paschal has had stints with the Utah Jazz and the Golden State Warriors, and then Mikal Bridges is one of the best two-way players in the NBA. And just looking back at these guys all being on the same roster and winning national titles together is pretty incredible. And I think it sets this Villanova program apart in their run of 2 championships in 3 years as definitely being the most talented group.
Yes, I would agree with that as well. Just like Jalen Brunson, it's like you said, a top point guard, and DiVincenzo and Hart are also main contributors on that Knicks squad. And Mikal Bridges is a top wing in today's NBA. It was just loaded with everybody.
Yeah, you got any other thoughts on the Final Four in general, or the matchup we saw, or anything else on this list?
I thought Alabama was maybe gonna give UConn a scare, but did not happen.
They
I
kind of
thought that
did
was
for a
maybe
while, to be
they did
honest.
for a little bit, but at the end, UConn kind of did that championship gear, as teams like to say, and pulled away and kind of put that to rest.
Yeah, there was never really a point where I was sitting there thinking, oh, Alabama might win this game. I pretty much thought all along that UConn was still in the driver's seat. Want to give NC State a quick shout once again. Winning 9 straight elimination games is incredible. Ran into a pretty tough Purdue team, bad matchup for them. DJ Burns really had no answer for Zach Edey. They were in foul trouble much of that game, but nonetheless, an incredible run for Kevin Keatts and NC State, as Kevin Keatts was on the hot seat entering the ACC tournament, went on to win 5 games in 5 days to clinch the ACC tournament championship, which was monumental for NC State as a program moving forward. And then to add to that, getting all the way to the Final Four to Phoenix for the first time in a long time, kind of rivaling that 83 run. Not quite able to get it done, but definitely a season for the history books for NC State. DJ Burns will probably be forever immortalized as a March Madness legend, just with how fun to watch he was, how skilled he is at that little spin move and hook shot. He just captured the hearts of fans everywhere, including myself, even as a fan of a rival ACC school. So definitely a great run by NC State. Just had to give them a quick shout. And the last thing we're going to touch on today's episode, just the coaching carousel domino effect that has happened in the past week or so in college basketball. It all started with SMU firing Rob Lanier after 2 seasons. Sounds like they're looking for new leadership heading into the ACC, even though SMU, I would say, for their standards, had a pretty good season this year. That came as a little bit of a shock, and that immediately led to Andy Enfield leaving the University of Southern California for SMU for a lower pressure job, lower expectations, things of that nature. And then what does USC do? They go and hire away one of the best coaches, in my opinion, Eric Musselman from Arkansas, who's just done great things with that program. A couple of Elite Eights in the past few years, consistent Sweet 16s. This year, I would say, for Arkansas was less on coaching and recruiting and more on locker room dynamics. If you want to learn more about that, just go on social media and look up Arkansas basketball locker room, and I'm sure you'll find out a lot of interesting things there. But I have a lot of respect for Eric Musselman, and obviously USC does as well. They hire him away, and then Arkansas hiring away John Calipari from Kentucky. What are your thoughts on that, JC?
I think that was just a whole wild scenario, a roller coaster of like 48 hours for I think Arkansas and Kentucky fan bases, I would say. I mean, I remember sitting here, I think it was Sunday night, and like late at night, an Arkansas reporter reported that Calipari and Arkansas were in touch. And then it's things fast forward, and all of a sudden he's signing. But up until yesterday, and then there were reports that, he was trying to go back to Kentucky. So it's just been a wild ride. I think Arkansas downgraded with this hire. I think he'll be able to
Definitely.
get talent to Arkansas, but the winning aspect, I don't think he really has. And I think Musselman, like you said, is a top 5, 7 coach in college basketball. It was more of, I think guys on his team last year were more there for themselves and didn't really want to win. They're all looking to the NBA, and that's a hard spot to be put in as a coach, if I was saying.
Yeah, and obviously when you hire a guy like Calipari, you're going to get those top recruits. He has an incredible history of success in getting top recruits, developing them for the NBA in the short time that they are there. But what really hasn't happened is winning on the court during that time. A lot of these one and dones just there, kind of showing flashes all season as a team, but then can't really put it together in March. Obviously, the lone title for John Calipari in his time at Kentucky, which just quite frankly does not live up to their standards. He's going to have a pretty deep pocketbook in terms of NIL at Arkansas with those rich donors, the Walton family, who own and founded Walmart, and then Tyson Chicken as well. Some top donors
Hmm.
there. He's going to have some deep pockets. Definitely going to be able to woo in some top recruits like he did at Kentucky for with those NIL dollars. But I worry for Arkansas that he is not going to have near the success in the tournament that Eric Musselman was able to have. And I think Eric Musselman, on the flip side, is going to be able to translate over into the Big Ten with USC and possibly make USC a pretty favorable power there. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think Eric Musselman was a great hire for USC. I think him just all that talent in LA and California, him just being out there now, I think he's going to just take it all up. It'll be him and UCLA, and I think they'll probably split on some, but he was bringing in talent to Arkansas, and I think Calipari will bring in his guys, but it's not going to be that much of a difference than what Musselman was even doing there. So I think he can get the top guys, and he's a phenomenal coach. So I think he'll be able to. I think people will be surprised how quick USC gets brought back up.
Yeah, USC kind of gets that little advantage in recruiting just from their national brand being in Los Angeles. It's pretty much an ideal situation for an 18-year-old coming out of high school that wants to be on the fast track to the NBA. It's a pretty great location to be. Definitely well sought after. They're going to have a lot of NIL opportunities there as well. I think Musselman knew that he can capitalize on his recruiting and his talent as a coach. And I think it's also going to be a pretty good hire for USC moving forward. Well, that wraps us up for this episode of SM Sports Radio. JC, thank you so much for joining us, filling in for Micah, who's feeling a little bit under the weather this week. Hopefully next week we'll be getting back to our regular content. But thank you so much for tuning in to this episode, this shorter episode that was really all about college basketball. And unfortunately, JC, we'll have to wait 6 long months before we can talk about this great sport again, other than the transfer portal, which will be open for the next about month and a half or so. Definitely stay tuned on social media. Maybe we'll get some updates on this platform about what goes on in the transfer portal. But until then, we kind of got to put a bow on college basketball, unfortunately, and that's not good news for guys like me and JC who just live and breathe this sport. But thank you for tuning in. Until next time, this is SM Sports Radio with Samuel Goodrow, and today with JC Mitchell.